I could never have imagined that an ordinary day would change my entire life. After 3 exhausting weeks of business trips around the country, I was dreaming of only one thing: returning to the comfort of my home and the comforting presence of my wife, Maria. The plane trip had been particularly difficult, with turbulence that upset my stomach and a neighbor who snored non-stop for the 4-hour flight. In the taxi taking me home, I was already picturing myself collapsed in my favorite armchair, a cold beer in hand, maybe even ordering a pizza. Those small, simple pleasures had been sorely missed during my absence. The driver, a friendly man in his 50s, tried to make conversation, but I was too tired to keep up a coherent dialogue. When we finally arrived in front of my house, something seemed different. I wouldn't have known exactly what, but my instinct told me something was wrong. There was a car I didn't recognize parked in our driveway, a large grey Volvo that certainly wasn't there when I left. I paid the taxi and retrieved my suitcase from the trunk, my legs still numb from the long journey. The cool night air felt good but didn't manage to dispel that strange feeling growing inside me. As I approached the front door, I noticed boxes piled near the living room window. My heart began to beat faster. The key turned in the lock with its familiar sound, but what awaited me behind that door was anything but familiar. The smell hit me first, a mix of perfume I knew all too well, the one my mother-in-law had worn since I met her. That persistent fragrance that always gave me a headache during family meals. The living room, my refuge of peace, was unrecognizable. Furniture I had never seen stood in the middle of the room. A hideous olive green velvet armchair, which I had already seen at my in-laws' house, had taken the place of my comfortable leather sofa. Kitchen knickknacks covered my carefully organized shelves, and family photos I didn't recognize now decorated my walls. My suitcase slipped from my hands and fell to the floor with a dull thud. It was at that moment that I saw her, my mother-in-law, Francoise, comfortably installed on my sofa, calmly watching television as if she were in her own home. She was wearing her housecoat, the one with the floral patterns she liked so much, and sipping tea from my favorite mug. "Oh, Tomas. You arrived earlier than expected," she said in a casual tone, as if her presence was the most natural thing in the world. Not a hello, not an apology, nothing to indicate she was aware of how absurd the situation was. I had to lean against the wall to keep from staggering. The fatigue from the trip, the jet lag, and now this. It was too much. Questions crowded my mind. Where was Maria? Why was my mother-in-law installed in my house? And above all, why hadn't anyone warned me? What or how? The words got stuck in my throat. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Francoise, what does all this mean?" She put down her teacup, carefully adjusting the cushion behind her back. "Oh, don't worry, we arranged everything with Maria. You know, since the house became too big for the two of us, Robert and I decided it would be more practical to come live here." Maria agreed. Rage rose in me like a wave. Maria agreed? Without even talking to me? Without even consulting me? I clenched my fists so tightly my nails dug into my palms. The fatigue from the trip evaporated, replaced by a dull anger. "Where is Maria?" I asked, trying to control my trembling voice. "She went shopping. Robert too, by the way, went to fetch the rest of our things." She made a vague gesture with her hand, as if all this was just a minor detail. I looked around, really observing the magnitude of the changes. Boxes were piled in every corner, some still closed, others half empty. My books had been displaced to make room for a collection of porcelain I recognized from my in-laws' house. The smell of their home had already begun to permeate the walls. "You can't do this," I said, my voice becoming firmer. "You can't just decide to move into someone's house without their permission." Francoise let out a small condescending laugh that made me see red. "Tomas, don't be so dramatic. We are family, after all. And besides, this house is too big for just the two of you. It's more logical this way, don't you think?" I took a few steps around the room, running my hand through my hair, desperately trying not to lose my cool. Memories of all the times my mother-in-law had interfered in our lives came to mind, the surprise Sunday visits, the comments about our lifestyle, the unsolicited suggestions about our home decor. But this was the last straw. "No, I don't think so," I replied dryly. I come back from a long business trip to find you've invaded my home without my consent. It's not normal, Francoise. It's not acceptable. She frowned, visibly annoyed by my reaction. Invaded? What a rude word. I remind you that I am your wife's mother. You should be grateful we are here to help you. Help us. Help us with what exactly? We've never asked for help. My voice was rising despite myself. Where are my things? What have you done with my furniture? Oh, don't worry about that, she replied dismissively. We put everything in the garage. Anyway, that old leather sofa was really ugly. And besides, look how cozy the living room is now. This was too much. The anger that had been boiling in me since my arrival exploded. Without thinking, I headed to the nearest box and lifted it. No, no, and no. This is not going to happen. I started carrying the box towards the front door, determined to take back control of my home. The sound of my steps echoed in the sudden silence, only disturbed by the faint sound of the television in the background. Tomas, stop right now. Francois' scream echoed in the living room as I continued moving their boxes. Their knickknacks jingled dangerously every time I dropped a box on the porch. Sweat began to bead on my forehead, but anger gave me an energy I didn't think I had after such a long trip. No, you are the ones who are going to stop, I responded without even turning around. You can't just show up at someone's house. This is not your home. I heard Francoise stirring behind me, her voice rising to a high pitch as she lost control of the situation. Maria, she called on the phone. Your husband has gone mad. You need to come back immediately. I had just lifted another box when I heard hurried steps on the stairs. Maria appeared, her hair still damp from the shower, her face distraught. She hadn't gone shopping as her mother had said. Another lie. Tomas, what are you doing? She exclaimed, her eyes quickly moving from the scattered boxes on the porch to my red face of anger. What am I doing? What am I doing? My voice trembled. I come home after 3 weeks of absence to find your mother settled in our living room, our furniture in the garage, and you accepted all this without even talking to me. Maria approached me, her hands raised in a placating gesture. Listen, I wanted to talk to you, but you were so busy with your work. And besides, it's temporary, just until they... Temporary? I interrupted. Your mother has already redecorated the entire living room. She's thrown our furniture into the garage. She's drinking from my favorite mug, for God's sake. Francoise stood up from her armchair, adjusting her housecoat as if preparing to give an important speech. Maria, dear, your husband is behaving like a child. We had agreed this was the best solution for everyone. No, I growled, you had agreed. No one asked me anything. And now I find my house transformed into... I don't even know what. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway caught our attention. Robert, my father-in-law, got out of his Volvo, his face freezing when he saw the boxes scattered on the porch. He slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. What is going on here? He thundered, climbing the steps. Who has moved our things? Your son-in-law is making a scene, Francoise replied disdainfully. He doesn't understand we are here to help. Robert planted himself in front of me, puffing out his chest as he always did when he wanted to assert his authority. Even after all these years, he still treated me like the young man dating his daughter, not like an adult, a husband, a homeowner. Listen to me, boy, he began, pointing an accusing finger at my chest. You can't treat our things like this. We decided, as a family, that this was the best solution. As a family? I exploded. Am I not part of this family? Or am I just a bystander whose opinion doesn't count? The atmosphere was electric. Maria stood between us, tears in her eyes, visibly not knowing which side to take. Her loyalty was divided between her husband and her parents, and I could see the suffering on her face. Tomas, she murmured, please, calm down. We can discuss it calmly, find a solution. A solution? I repeated incredulously. The solution is for your parents to pack their things and go back to their house. End of story. Robert took another step towards me, his face reddening dangerously. How dare you talk to us like that? After everything we've done for you. Who helped you find this house? Who lent you money for the down payment? There it is, I shouted. I was wondering how long it would take for you to mention the money. But we've paid you back every cent, and you know it very well. Francoise began to sob theatrically, collapsing into her olive green armchair. See, Maria? See how he treats us? Your father and I only wanted to help you, to be closer to you. Closer to us? I mocked. You live 20 minutes away. Wasn't that close enough to watch over and meddle in our affairs? Maria burst into tears. Stop. Stop all of you. I can't take it anymore. But no one listened to her. Robert continued to glare at me with a dark look, Francoise continued her laments, and I felt my patience crumbling like sand between my fingers. You know what? I said, grabbing my car keys. Keep the house. Keep everything. I'm leaving. Tomas, no. Maria tried to hold me by the arm, but I gently pulled away. I can't stay here. Not like this. Not with them imposing and you letting them do it. My voice broke on those last words. If you walk out that door, Robert threatened, don't even think about coming back. I laughed bitterly. Threatening to kick me out of my own house? Really? I turned to Maria. Do you see? Do you see what's happening? But my wife stood there, paralyzed between her parents and me, her cheeks wet with tears. That image broke my heart, but I couldn't bear this situation any longer. Not after an exhausting flight, not after discovering my house invaded, not after this explosive confrontation. I walked down the porch steps, avoiding the boxes I had moved myself. Behind me, I heard Francoise comforting Maria, saying I was ungrateful, that I didn't deserve her daughter, that it was all my fault. Robert continued to shout threats and insults. As I got into my car, I took one last look at my house. Our house. The one Maria and I had chosen together, furnished little by little, where we had created our memories. And now, it looked like an emotional war zone, with boxes scattered like collateral victims of this family conflict. I started the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I couldn't stay a minute longer. As I drove away, I saw in the rearview mirror Maria running a few steps behind the car before stopping, defeated. That image would haunt me for days. The streets passed before my eyes without me really seeing them. Night was falling, and the streetlights were turning on one by one, creating a kind of luminous tunnel guiding me away from that chaos. My hands still trembled on the wheel, and my mind replayed the scene I had just lived in a loop. I drove without really knowing where to go, turning randomly down familiar streets. The idea of going to a hotel crossed my mind, but the prospect of being alone in an impersonal room after all this seemed unbearable. I thought of calling Pablo, my best friend, but remembered he was on vacation with his family. Almost instinctively, my car took the direction of my father's house. It was as if my subconscious had decided for me, naturally seeking that refuge that had always been there in difficult times. The way to his house was so familiar I could have driven it with my eyes closed. The steep downhill after the supermarket, the sharp turn near the elementary school, then that long straight line bordered by plane trees. My father's house hadn't changed since my childhood. It was a modest one-story house with a small garden where he grew vegetables and did DIY projects in his workshop. The light filtering through the workshop windows indicated he was still there, probably working on one of his many projects. I parked in the driveway, next to his old Peugeot that he refused to replace despite my repeated advice. It still runs perfectly, he always said, why change it? That thought brought a weak smile to my lips, the first since I had crossed the threshold of my house a few hours earlier. The sound of my steps on the gravel must have alerted him because the workshop door opened before I reached the porch. My father appeared in the doorway, a screwdriver in hand, his work glasses pushed up on his forehead. One look was enough for him to understand something was wrong. Tomas, he said simply, his face shifting from surprise to concern in a fraction of a second. I stopped a few steps from him, suddenly aware I looked terrible, my shirt wrinkled from the trip, my tie askew, my hair disheveled from running my hands through it in frustration. Dad! My voice broke on that simple word, and all the tension accumulated since my return seemed to crystallize in my throat. Without a word, he put down his screwdriver and motioned for me to follow him inside. That was one of the things I had always appreciated about my father, his ability to understand without needing explanations. He knew when to talk and when to remain silent, when to push and when to wait. The inside of the house was warm and familiar. The smell of freshly brewed coffee floated in the air, mixed with the scent of wood my father worked on in his workshop. On the kitchen table, there were plans and sketches scattered, witnesses of his latest project. My father took out 2 cups from the cupboard and filled them with coffee. He pushed one towards me before sitting down across from me at the kitchen table. The silence between us was not heavy, it was patient, waiting for me to find my words. "I don't even know where to start," I finally said, fixing my gaze on the steaming black liquid in my cup. "From the beginning, usually, it's simpler," he replied with that small smile at the corner of his lips that was characteristic of him. Then I let it all out. The words came out like a torrent: my return, the discovery of my in-laws settled in my house, the confrontation, the betrayal felt at Maria's decision, my anger, my flight. My father listened without interrupting, his blue eyes, the same as mine, fixed on me attentively. "The worst," I concluded, "is that Maria did nothing. She just stood there, between her parents and me, saying nothing. As if my opinion didn't matter." My father took a long sip of coffee before speaking. "You know, Tomas, sometimes the people we love find themselves caught between 2 loyalties. It's not that they don't love us, it's that they don't know how to handle the conflict. But it's our house, Dad. Our space. How can she let her parents impose like this?" He nodded slowly. "I understand your anger. Really. But remember that Maria grew up with parents, let's say, invasive. For her, it's normal. Maybe she didn't realize how problematic this situation could be for you." I ran a hand over my tired face. The last few hours seemed unreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. "And now? What do I do?" I asked, suddenly feeling like a lost child seeking answers from his father. "Now," he said, getting up to warm our cups, "you sleep. You're exhausted, angry, and you're not in a condition to make decisions. The guest room is always ready, you know that." He was right, of course. The fatigue from the trip, amplified by the shock and confrontation, was beginning to weigh heavily on my shoulders. But one thing still worried me. "And tomorrow?" My father leaned against the kitchen counter, looking at me with that wise expression that had guided me so many times in my life. "Tomorrow, we'll think of a solution. Together. As we always have." Those simple words had an immediate calming effect. In that familiar kitchen, with my father who had always known how to bring me back to earth, the problems suddenly seemed less insurmountable. Not resolved, no, but at least approachable. Later, lying in the bed of the guest room, I listened to the familiar sounds of the house: my father tidying his workshop, the old radiator clicking, the wind in the garden trees. Those sounds of my childhood were comforting, like a lullaby promising that tomorrow would be another day. My phone vibrated several times, messages from Maria, probably, but I didn't have the courage to read them. Not tonight. Tonight, I needed that refuge, that pause in the storm. The questions, the decisions, the confrontations would wait until tomorrow. The next morning, I woke up with the first rays of the sun filtering through the guest room curtains. For a few blissful seconds, I forgot the events of the previous day. Then everything came back to me like a wave: the boxes, the olive green armchair, the shouting, Maria crying. The smell of coffee and freshly made toast wafted up from the kitchen. My father had always been an early riser, a habit he had kept from his years working in the factory. I found him sitting at the kitchen table, the day's newspaper spread out in front of him, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. "Did you sleep well?" he asked without looking up from the newspaper. "Better than I thought," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. He folded his newspaper and set it aside. "Have you checked your phone?" I shook my head. I had left it on silent all night and still didn't have the courage to check the messages. "Maria called the landline this morning," he said softly. "Very early. She was worried about not hearing from you." My heart sank. Maria knew I often went from me when I needed to think. It was our refuge for both of us, in fact. We had even come here after our first big fight, years ago. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you were here, that you were okay, and that you needed a bit of time. He paused, looking at me over his glasses. She was crying, Tomos. I closed my eyes, feeling guilt mix with my still present anger. I know I shouldn't have left like that, but what could I do? They invaded our house, Dad. Without asking my opinion, without even talking to me. My father got up to put 2 new slices of bread in the toaster. You know, when your mother and I got married, her family also wanted to intrude into our lives. Her mother would show up unannounced, reorganize our cabinets, criticize my way of mowing the lawn. And how did you handle that? A small smile appeared on his face. Badly, at first. I would get angry, go for a drive, exactly like you. Then one day, your mother took me aside and told me something I never forgot. He sat back down, pushing a plate of toast towards me. She said, Michelle, if you want my family to respect our boundaries, we first have to agree on those boundaries together. Those words resonated with me. Maria and I had never really discussed our boundaries with her family. We had let things happen, avoiding conflicts, until the situation became untenable. The problem, I said, crumbling a piece of toast distractedly, is that now the situation is completely out of control. How can we go back? My father got up to fetch a notepad and pen from the kitchen drawer. I watched him do so with curiosity. He had always had this habit of writing down problems, breaking them down point by point. First, he began, sitting down, you need to talk to Maria. Not to her parents, not to everyone at the same time. Just Maria. He wrote this point on the paper in his careful handwriting. Then, you need to decide together what you want. Not what her parents want, not what you want alone, but what you both want for your home. I nodded slowly. But how can I make her understand that what her parents have done is not normal? By listening to her first, he responded simply. There is surely a reason why she accepted this situation. Maybe her parents are going through difficulties you are not aware of. Maybe she feels guilty about something. You'll only know by listening to her. He was right, of course. In my anger, I hadn't even tried to understand why Maria had accepted this situation. I had felt betrayed and reacted impulsively. And if she insists they stay? My father put down his pen and looked me directly in the eyes. Then you negotiate. You find a compromise. Maybe they can stay temporarily, with clear conditions and a set departure date. Maybe you can help them find an apartment nearby. There are always solutions, Tomos. And legally? I asked, a new idea crossing my mind. Do they have the right to settle in our house like this? No, technically, they don't have the right. The house is yours and Maria's. But do you really want to go down that path? Taking your in-laws to court? I grimaced at that idea. No, of course not. But it's good to know the law is on our side, just in case. My father continued writing down points, establishing clear rules, setting a duration, defining common and private spaces. His methodical approach helped me see things more clearly, turning this emotional chaos into a concrete problem to solve. You know, he said, putting down his pen, sometimes crises like this can strengthen a couple. If you handle this situation well, if you listen to each other and find a solution together, your relationship will be stronger. I took my phone out of my pocket and turned it on. 15 missed calls from Maria, about 20 messages. The last one simply said, I'm sorry. Please, come home. You're right, I said to my father. I need to go back and talk to Maria. But, would you mind coming with me? Not to intervene, just to be there. Your presence has always had a calming effect. He smiled, that warm smile that had the power to reassure me since my childhood. Of course, son. That's what fathers are for. The drive back was made in relative silence, only interrupted by the familiar noise of my father's car engine. He had insisted on driving, saying I was still too angry. I watched the landscape pass by, my stomach tightening a little more with each kilometer that brought us closer to the house. Do you know what you're going to say? My father asked as we approached our street. Not really, I admitted. I'm trying not to plan it too much. Last time I did that, everything I had planned went out the window as soon as Francoise opened her mouth. He laughed softly. Your mother-in-law has that particular gift, it's true. But remember, today you talk to Maria first. The others can wait. Turning onto our street, I immediately noticed that Robert's Volvo was no longer there. The boxes I had moved out the night before had also disappeared from the porch. My heart began to beat faster. Was that a good sign? Or did it mean my in-laws had settled in definitively, their things now neatly arranged inside? My father parked in front of the house and turned off the engine. "Are you ready?" I took a deep breath. As ready as I'll ever be. We got out of the car and climbed the porch steps. Before I could take out my keys, the door opened. Maria stood in the doorway, her eyes red from crying, but with a small smile of relief on her lips. "Tomas," she murmured. Without thinking, I stepped forward and took her in my arms. She nestled against me, her body shaking with small sobs. "I'm sorry," she murmured against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry." My father stayed back, giving us that moment. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Francoise appear in the hallway, then retreat discreetly upon seeing us embrace. For once, she had the good sense not to intervene. "Can we talk?" I asked Maria softly. "Just you and me, first." She nodded, pulling away slightly to wipe her tears. "My parents are in the kitchen," she said. "We can go to the garden." I nodded, relieved that she herself suggested a private place for our conversation. My father stepped forward. "I'll keep your parents company, if that's okay," he said to Maria with a reassuring smile. She returned the smile, grateful. My father had always had a gift for easing tensions, even in the most delicate situations. His presence was like a balm on an open wound. In the garden, the cool morning air enveloped us. Maria and I sat on the small bench near the cherry tree we had planted together last year. A moment of silence settled, neither of us knowing where to start. "I didn't want to leave like that yesterday," I finally said. "But when I arrived and saw—" "I know," she interrupted softly. "I should have talked to you earlier. I should have called you as soon as my parents mentioned the idea of coming to live here. Why didn't you?" She nervously played with the wedding ring on her finger, a gesture she always made when she was anxious. "Dad lost his job 2 months ago. They didn't want to tell you because they were ashamed. Mom started panicking about their mortgage, and then—" "2 months," I repeated, surprised. "Why didn't you tell me? You were so busy with your project, always traveling. I didn't want to worry you. And besides, at first, we thought Dad would find a job quickly. But the weeks passed, and—" She took a deep breath before continuing. "When they talked about selling their house, Mom started crying. She said they were too old to start over, that they were afraid of ending up on the street. Dad didn't say anything, but I could see he was devastated." My heart sank. Now I understood better why Maria had accepted this situation. The guilt, the worry for her parents, the fear of overburdening me with their problems. But settling in our house without even telling me— "I know it was a mistake," she said, taking my hand. "Mom started moving their things little by little while you were traveling, saying it was temporary, just until they got reorganized. And before I realized what was really happening, she had already reorganized the whole house." In the kitchen, through the window, I could see my father talking calmly with my in-laws. Robert seemed smaller than usual, his shoulders hunched under the weight of their problems. Francoise listened attentively, for once in silence. "We could have found a solution together," I said softly. "If you had told me." "I know," she murmured. "I was scared. Scared of your reaction, scared of having to choose between you and my parents. And in the end, that's exactly what happened." I pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "We are a team, Maria. We have to face these things together, not separately." She nodded against my shoulder. "What do we do now?" "Now," I said, straightening up, "we go inside and talk to everyone. Find a real solution, not an imposed one. But first, I want you to know one thing." "What?" "No matter what happens, I will never make you choose between your parents and me. We will find a way to help your parents without destroying our own home." With tears in her eyes, she hugged me tightly. In the kitchen, my father gave us a small nod through the window. It was time to face the situation, all together this time. The kitchen seemed smaller with everyone gathered around the table. My father had strategically seated himself between Robert and me, while Maria stayed by my side, her hand squeezing mine under the table. Francoise, unusually silent, stared at her teacup as if it contained all the answers to our problems. "Well," my father began in his calm voice, "I think we all need to clear things up." Robert raised his head, his face bearing the marks of a sleepless night. He seemed to have aged 10 years since the previous evening. "Tomas," he said, his voice hoarse, "I owe you an apology for last night. We handled things poorly." It was the first time I had heard my father-in-law apologize for anything. The shock left me momentarily speechless. "Maria explained that you weren't aware of our situation," he continued. "We should have talked to you directly, but pride." His voice broke on that last word. Francoise placed a hand on her husband's arm. "We were scared," she admitted. "When Robert lost his job, everything fell apart so quickly. The bills piling up, the letters from the bank." "But why didn't you tell me?" I asked, trying to keep a neutral tone. "We could have looked for solutions together." "Are you kidding?" Francoise snapped, regaining her usual verbosity. "How could we ask for your help when you spend your time on business trips? You're barely present for our daughter, and you expect us to." "Mom," Maria cut in with a sharp tone. "We said we would discuss this calmly." My father cleared his throat. "Maybe we should start by establishing the facts. Robert, you lost your job 2 months ago. What steps have you taken since then?" Robert ran a tired hand over his face. "I've sent out resumes, had some interviews, but at my age, companies prefer to hire young people." "And your house?" my father continued. "Have you talked about selling it?" "We are 3 months behind on the mortgage," Francoise murmured, tears in her eyes. "The bank is threatening foreclosure." I felt Maria's hand tremble in mine. All that stress she had kept to herself these past months, all that worry she hadn't dared to share with me. "Okay," I said slowly, "I understand the situation better now. But settling in here without telling me was not the solution." "You can't." "And what was the solution according to you?" Francoise cut in, her voice rising an octave. "Leaving your in-laws on the street. Is that how you were raised, Michel?" My father didn't take the bait. "Francoise, no one here is talking about leaving you on the street. But you must understand that showing up at someone's house unannounced, reorganizing their home." "We're not showing up at someone's house," Francoise protested, her cheeks red with emotion. "It's our daughter's house too." "Exactly," I said, feeling my patience crumble. "It's our house, Maria's, and mine. A space we created together, with our rules, our customs." "Our rules?" Francoise mocked. "Like the one about never being home? Leaving Maria alone for weeks? That's enough." Maria's voice cracked like a whip. "Mom, stop attacking Tomas. My life choices and my marriage are none of your business." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Robert stared at his hands on the table, Francoise seemed on the verge of tears, and my father observed us all with a thoughtful expression. "Maybe," he said softly, "we should talk about concrete solutions instead of blaming each other. Robert, have you considered taking a temporary job while you find something in your field?" Robert shook his head. "At my age, starting from the bottom. It's better than losing your house, isn't it?" I suggested, trying to soften my tone. "And your unemployment insurance?" my father asked. "You must have some rights." "We've used it all," Francoise murmured. "The savings, the insurance. Everything went to mortgage payments and bills." Maria straightened up suddenly. "What if we sell the house before the bank forecloses? That would give you some money to start over, wouldn't it?" "To go where?" Francoise asked, her voice trembling slightly. "There are apartments for rent in the complex near the park," I said, an idea taking shape. "It's not very big, but it's well maintained, and the rent is reasonable." "An apartment?" Francoise seemed horrified. "After 30 years in our house?" "It's temporary, Mom," Maria insisted. "The time for Dad to find a job, for you to get back on your feet." Robert raised his hand to interrupt his wife, who was about to protest. "She's right, Francoise. We can't continue like this. We can't impose on the kids and destroy their marriage at the same time. Tears began to stream down Francois's cheeks. But our house. All our memories. The memories we carry with us, my father said kindly. What matters is the family, not the walls. A new silence settled, less tense this time, more reflective. I could almost see the gears turning in everyone's heads, weighing the options, evaluating the possibilities. How long would it take, Robert finally asked, to find an apartment? I can look into it today, I offered. And in the meantime, Maria completed, you can stay here. But with clear rules, defined spaces, and a set deadline. Francoise opened her mouth to protest, but Robert placed his hand on hers. Agreed, he said simply. We accept. The following morning, I was sitting in the office of Mr. Lambert, a real estate lawyer my father had known for years. He was a man in his 50s, with round glasses and a reassuring manner of presenting things. Maria sat next to me, her notebook open on her lap. So, if I understand correctly, Mr. Lambert said, flipping through the documents we had brought, your in-laws are at risk of foreclosure, and you want to manage the situation, let's say, preventively. Exactly, I replied. We want to help them sell their house before the bank forecloses, and at the same time, establish a legal framework for their temporary stay in our house. The lawyer nodded, jotting down some notes. Let's start with their house. You said 3 months behind on mortgage payments. Yes, Maria confirmed, her voice trembling slightly. And the bank is threatening to start foreclosure proceedings. We still have some leeway, Mr. Lambert explained. The law provides several stages before an effective foreclosure. We can negotiate with the bank, perhaps obtain an extension to organize an amicable sale. I felt Maria relax slightly next to me. Since our heated discussion the previous evening, she had oscillated between hope and anxiety. And for their stay in our house? I asked. How can we frame that legally? Mr. Lambert pulled a new form from his drawer. I advise you to establish a temporary accommodation agreement. It's a document that sets the conditions of their stay, duration, contribution to expenses, assigned spaces. My parents won't like that, Maria murmured. Especially Mom. She'll say we're treating them like strangers. It's not a matter of trust, the lawyer explained gently. It's a protection for everyone. Without a legal framework, the situation could become complicated. He began to list the points to define: maximum duration of the stay, distribution of common and private spaces, contribution to current expenses, conditions for departure. Each word seemed to make the situation more real, more concrete. And if they refused to leave at the end of the agreed period? Maria asked in a small voice. The lawyer removed his glasses, carefully cleaning them with a handkerchief. It is precisely to avoid this type of situation that we establish this document. Without a written agreement, they could theoretically claim a right of occupation. I felt my stomach tighten. The very idea of having to evict my in-laws made me nauseous, but I understood the need for these precautions. I propose we draft 2 separate documents, Mr. Lambert continued. One for the accommodation agreement, and another for the procedures related to selling their house. Everything needs to be clear and separate. For the next hour, we worked on the details of these documents. The lawyer typed on his computer, regularly stopping to ask our opinion on certain points. The duration of the stay was set at 3 months, renewable once if necessary. The spaces were clearly defined. They would be assigned the guest room and the bathroom on the ground floor. The rest of the house would be considered common space. For the contribution to expenses, the lawyer suggested, I advise setting a fixed monthly amount. This will avoid discussions about who consumes what. Maria nodded. And for their furniture? The ones they've already installed in our house? We can make an inventory, I proposed. Note what belongs to them, what belongs to us, to avoid any confusion later. The lawyer approved. Excellent point. I'll add an annex for that. When he printed the documents, their weight in my hands seemed to represent all the seriousness of the situation. These few pages were going to change the dynamics of our family, for better or worse. How do we present them? Maria asked as we left the office. I don't want them to feel like we're intruders. I completed softly. It's precisely to avoid that feeling that we're doing things by the book. So everything is clear from the start. On the way back, we made a detour to the real estate agency near the park. The agent showed us several photos of available apartments. One in particular caught our attention, a 3-room apartment on the first floor, with a small balcony overlooking the park. The rent was reasonable, especially compared to their current mortgage payments. Do you think they'll accept? Maria asked as we parked in front of our house. They don't really have another choice, I replied, squeezing her hand. But we'll present this as a temporary solution, a new beginning, not as a defeat. When we entered the house, we found Francoise preparing lunch. The smell of her famous gratin dauphinois filled the air. It was her way of making peace, I suppose. Ah, there you are, she said, trying to sound cheerful. I thought a good meal would do us all good. Robert was sitting in the living room, flipping through the job ads in the local newspaper. He looked up as we entered, his gaze lingering on the documents we were holding. We have something to show you, I said softly. Something that could help us all move forward. The weeks that followed were like a slow balancing act, each of us trying to find our place in this new family setup. The gratin dauphinois from that day had finally served as a silent mediator as we presented the documents to my in-laws. Against all odds, it was Robert who took the initiative, carefully reading each clause while Francoise looked out the window, discreetly wiping away some tears. It's reasonable, he finally said, putting the papers down on the table. We can't keep living in denial. Our house, we've already lost it, even if we didn't want to admit it. The apartment near the park turned out to be a pleasant surprise. During the visit, Francoise had pursed her lips at first, used to something larger, but when she discovered the balcony with its empty planters, her eyes lit up. I could plant my herbs there, she murmured, and I saw Maria smile for the first time in days. The sale of their house was organized faster than expected. Mr. Lambert had worked wonders with the bank, negotiating an additional extension that allowed us to find a buyer at a reasonable price. Not what they would have gotten under normal conditions, but enough to pay off their debts and have a small cushion to start again. The hardest part was sorting through their belongings. 30 years of life don't fit easily into a 3-room apartment. Each moved object triggered a story, a memory, sometimes tears. Maria spent hours with her mother, listening to the tales linked to each trinket, each photo, each piece of furniture. Do you remember this vase? Francoise would say, holding up a hideous olive green vase. It was the first gift your father gave me. He had such bad taste back then. And they would laugh together, while Robert and I took care of the boxes in the garage. Those moments of regained complicity were well worth a few weeks of domestic chaos. Robert, for his part, surprised everyone. One morning, he came back wearing a slightly too large suit, bought at a second-hand store. I have an interview, he announced. For a security guard position at a residence. It's not my old salary, but it's a new beginning, Francoise completed, adjusting his tie with tender gestures I had never seen before. Life was slowly organizing itself. The defined spaces in the accommodation agreement allowed us to coexist without stepping on each other's toes. In the mornings, I sometimes found Robert in the kitchen, making coffee for everyone. Those moments of calm before the house woke up had become our silent ritual, a way to domesticate each other. Maria had regained her smile, although sometimes I caught her looking nostalgically at the photos of her childhood in her parents' house. One night, as we were cuddled up in our bed, she confided in me, "You know, I thought this situation was going to destroy us, but in reality, it has made us stronger." She was right. This crisis had forced us to communicate, to establish clear boundaries, to fight for our relationship while remaining supportive of her family. It wasn't always easy, but we were learning. The day of the move to the apartment came faster than expected. Robert had gotten the security guard job, and his first salary had allowed them to pay the deposit. Francoise had spent hours planning the layout of each room, regaining some of her old enthusiasm. "It's small," she said, supervising the movers, "but it's cozy. And besides, we'll be close to the park for when you have children." I saw Maria blush at that comment, and we shared a knowing look. Some things would never change, and maybe that was for the best. That night, after my in-laws had left, Maria and I found ourselves in our living room, finally ours again. The olive green armchair was gone, our furniture had reclaimed its place, but something had changed. The space felt different, as if those weeks of chaos had left an invisible mark. Maybe we should keep some of your mother's decorating ideas, I suggested, surprising Maria. Not the armchair, of course, but the plants in the kitchen, they weren't bad. She laughed, snuggling against me. Who are you and what have you done with my husband? I think your husband has learned a few lessons these past weeks, I replied, kissing her forehead. The following Sunday, we invited everyone for lunch, my in-laws, my father, even my sister who had returned from her trip. Francoise had brought her gratin, of course, and for the first time in a long time, the laughter around the table seemed natural, sincere. Looking at my family gathered, I realized my father had been right from the start. What matters are not the walls, but the people who inhabit them. Our house was not just our space, Maria's and mine, it had become the witness of a crisis we had gone through together, of a family rebuilt on stronger foundations. That night, after everyone had left, I found a small pot of herbs on the kitchen counter. Francoise had left it there, with a note, so you always have a bit of us with you, but just the right amount. Maria laughed when she read the note, and I laughed with her. We had survived the storm, and we had come out stronger, wiser, more united. Our house had regained its tranquility, but it carried within it the echo of those tumultuous weeks, as a reminder that sometimes, the greatest crises can lead to the most beautiful reconstructions.